The government has a debt problem, companies have a debt problem, but we're going to talk about households in this story.
And such a good, sobering, but important topic, right?
Yeah.
Debt is it is a real problem. Not enough people are realistic with, how much of their own debt they have. But if you want to see where is the economy going and how might that impact people, you have to ask.
Folks, we have a debt problem. The government has a debt problem, companies have a debt problem, but we're going to talk about households in this story because I don't think it's unfair to say that American households with $1.08 trillion in credit card debts, we're talking car loans over $1,000 a month payment, lots of stuff going on. We have household debt problems, but we're going to have this conversation with the wonderful Anna Kelly. How are you?
I'm doing great. So good to be here and such a good, sobering, but important topic, right?
Yeah.
Debt is it is a real problem. And we have a lot of people on social media slamming, and we should, right? Government debt. The government definitely has way too much debt, and that impacts us. And someday we all have to pay the piper with more taxes and economic pain, etc. But we talk about corporate debt when you look at, how's the stock market doing? But not enough people are realistic with, how much of their own debt they have. Nobody wants to talk about the stresses of their own debt, right? Nobody, there's shame behind it. People don't want to say I'm in debt. But if you want to see where is the economy going and how might that impact people, you have to ask, do we have a healthy economy? Are households healthy, or are households living check to check with a negative net worth? And the reality is people don't think about net worth. So go back and listen to the first video we did today. But if you have less assets than you have liabilities, you're bankrupt. You're
Mhm.
going through the motions, you're living check to check, but technically you're insolvent, right?
Yep. Yep.
So most people, I haven't kept up in the last month, but I do see that credit card debt just continues to go way up. People have blown through their COVID savings. They're increasing the amount they're putting on credit cards at 20, 22, 25% interest, by the way. They're defaulting on car loans, and now they have to start paying school loans. And so school loans are behind, car loans are behind, rents are behind, more and more delinquencies, and that could push through to some foreclosures as well. But debt is a real problem because if you don't have enough coming in and your interest rates go up like they are now, you have to decide, am I going to buy groceries this month? Am I going to pay
Yeah.
rent this month, pay my mortgage payment, or am I going to pay off my credit cards? And so we need to be real about, the condition of the economy. When you see Wall Street and the news saying GDP has gone up 4 or 5%, so the American economy is healthy, or Bidenomics wins because now we have more jobs. Like, the reality, if you want to see where somebody really is, look at debt, look at their
Yeah.
debt, because that really explains the health of the economy and the health of households. And there really is a big disconnect between what we see in Wall Street and the financial markets and what we see in households today.
And the reason I want to have this conversation is I have been through two trying times where debt was like the most important problem. Obviously, you and I invested through the Great Recession. We saw all the mortgages blow up. We know how that story ends. And the story of that was people just gave up. They literally gave their houses back. They were doing short sales, jingle mail, all of that, right? There is no question that the '08 crisis, or whatever year you want to put on it, was a real estate and mortgage debt problem because the debt reset, people walked away. But I actually experienced probably something that was even more meaningful that I've only started to remember recently, and that was the '80s, right? I was a child. I was a teenager,
Yeah.
maybe 12. My father was unemployed. My mother was a stay-at-home mom at this point, and the '80s were rough.
Mm.
And I remember my coming around the corner, right, out of either the family room or I don't know what you call it, foyer or whatever the heck it was called, into the kitchen. And my mom was sitting at this little brown kitchen table, and she had all of these bills spread out. And at the time, I don't know if they still do this, but they were different colors, right? And each color meant you were 30, 60, 90, whatever it was, late. And I don't remember much about that other than the look on her face, which was fear. At least I translated it as fear. And she said something like, I don't know if we can do it, Michael. And I'm like, I have no context, right? And she goes, I don't know if I can keep the home. And I still remember that. And the reason this is important to me is because I think what we're about to go through is a bad economic time where debt is the problem.
Yes.
But I suspect households will act a lot more like my mother did in the 80s. Because again, you got to remember the 80s to me are very similar today in respect to rates shot up.
Yes.
They got into a home with a relatively low rate. Rents were exploding. And she didn't want to take her kids out of the school. She didn't want to pay more for less. That's what she was struggling with.
Right.
So,
Same.
yeah, she's not paying the utility bill. You know, she's doing all of these things, robbing Peter to pay Paul. But what's important is there are so many people on social media today thinking we're going to repeat the '08 crisis where people just let their homes go that don't understand that they did that because it was cheaper to leave. Today, it's
Right.
not cheaper to leave by a mile. People give up their
Right.
homes today. They pay twice as much for half as much. To me,
Right.
this is the '80s again. Um, and I think there's a lot of households that will give up on their credit cards and their cars long before they lose the house. What do you think of all that?
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And I think this is very similar to the 80s. And I was, very young in the 80s. I was born in 74. So I was, 6 in 1980 and 11 in 1985. But I remember, my dad and my stepmom lived in a trailer, which was their first home purchase. So it was like a big deal that they even had that instead of an apartment. My mom lived in an apartment and worked 3 jobs. I remember she was an apartment manager, she waitressed, and then she bartended like round the clock just to make ends meet. And so I remember, the struggles that my parents had. Um, and I think that that's a lot of at the time I didn't really understand that what the 70s were and how that impacted them in the 80s and how high rates and things were. But again, as I reflect and I study the 70s, I had these light bulbs like, wow, this is what my parents were going through, and
Yeah.
my grandparents, and back then, similarly, I remember my grandparents having a conversation with my parents at the table, my dad, my stepmom, and said, you've got to pay off your house. Like there's no security other than a paid off house. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of crazy. Why would I do that when my rate's so low and I can go invest and make a lot more money? Back then, they couldn't. Their interest rates were so high. It was their biggest
Yeah.
expense was their house. And so they needed to pay that down because if one income earner lost their job and they were just on another, they'd lose their home. Now
Right.
we have a situation where 80% or more have mortgage rates locked in below 5, mostly below 4, and I think 40% ish below 3. So their payment today is substantially less than if they had to sell that house, go rent somewhere, or downsize. And so the last thing people are going to do, I think, is to let go of their home unless they had some kind of variable rate, mortgage and they're kind of stuck. But most people are in fixed mortgages. So it is different there. The other thing is in the United States, even if you declare bankruptcy, as long as you're making a payment on your primary home and you're up to date, you won't lose your home to that bankruptcy. And so I think as we look at what is the state of household debt and we see how much credit card debt has gone up, we see car payments and huge school loans that have to be paid back that hadn't been. Right now, if you don't pay your school loans, it doesn't go on your credit report. So what are people going to stop paying first, Michael? They're going to stop paying their school loans because, hey, they can't take my house and,
Mhm.
I'm not going to go bankrupt yet just for school loans. It doesn't impact my credit. So I think they're going to stop paying their school loans first, hope for some kind of forgiveness again.
Yeah.
And then they're going to stop paying their credit cards. And I think that when they realize they're paying 20% interest and then they have default rates that are even higher, eventually I think you're going to see a wave of bankruptcies and they're just going to let those, some school loans can be wiped out, some cannot. but they're going to let all that credit card go. They're going to let their $1,000 car payments go and, get a cheaper car for a while.
Yeah.
But I think they're going to prioritize making that mortgage payment and staying in their home, because at this point, their interest rates are locked low, 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 the lowest interest rate they're going to pay on anything that they have. And they're going to keep their houses. And I think that's what's going to keep us from having a repeat of 2008, where you have this mass inventory of supply, at least nationwide. I think most people are going to try to keep their home, but they may end up in really sad financial situations if they have to declare bankruptcy. That's going to impact their ability to have options to move ever, to be able to invest, be able to, buy properties that require credit, be able to get cars and things of that nature. So unfortunately, debt creates a lot of problems, and, barring bankruptcy, wiping it out, you've got to just continue to make more, work more, to pay it off at extremely high interest rates.
Yeah. I really do think there's a lot of people that just want to believe that people are going to walk from their homes. And again, as a kid at the time, and maybe it's, memories being fogged by decades. But I really do think mom and dad are going to be thinking about, where our kids put our heads down. I mean, I have so many people when I talk about this going like, you don't get it. They're going to keep the car because the car gets them to work. And oh, by the way, you could sleep in your car if you have to. I'm like, really? You're going to have your, you in the front seat, the kids in the back. Is that what we're talking about? The people just don't get it. The fact that people are bragging about having $1,000 car payment, that is ridiculous. Right. So I really do think people are going to give up the Tesla, and they're going to go get a
Yes.
crappy little $5,000 used car. That point A to point B is still, point A to point B. So I really think people are grossly misunderstanding the household. At the end of the day,
Yes.
the Great Recession, it was a financially good move to let the house go.
Right.
It is a horrible financial move to let the house go today for most people. And I don't
Right.
think people understand, because again, you come around, you're a 12-year-old boy, and you come around the corner and you see your mom with all these envelopes, and she tells you, I don't know if I could do it. I think there will
Yeah.
be lots of families going, the last thing to go is going to be our house. It's cheap. They don't want to move. It's big. They don't want to live with family. It's very different than the '08 crisis in my mind.
Sure. And I do think that as soon as we post this, people are going to go, oh, but, what about this? What about that? There's always exceptions. So we're talking about kind of like nationwide, the average homeowner who has a stable job, who didn't go crazy on the house that they bought, who have a low locked in rate. Most people are going to say,
Yep.
we want to stay in our community. We want to stay at our job or close. We want our kids in the same schools. They're going to prioritize the house. Now, you do have those, and this is where I think you're going to see some exceptions to this. You do have many who chose to move up, and they went to
Yep.
the very tippy top of what they could afford, even at the low interest rate. And if they're in a market where prices are coming down because they skyrocketed, I'm going to pick on Seattle, LA, Austin,
Austin.
right? So I
Right.
even picked on Texas. So, you have an area that the prices literally doubled. And they said, okay, rates are 3. So now instead of having the 2,000, I can afford a $4,000 payment, but I get a huge house and
Mhm.
I can afford it today. Well, if they're starting to be strapped and living check to check, or they're in tech in
Mhm.
Austin and they lose a job, or in
Yep.
tech in San Francisco and they lose a
Sure.
job, then those people who stretch their budget to the very top because of a low interest rate, I
Of
think
course.
they might say, and they should say,
I'm
okay,
out.
I had a $2,000 mortgage. I doubled and got a McMansion for 4,000, but now my job's at risk. Now values are coming down. Maybe I walk away from the house. So in the higher end homes,
Yeah.
where people really stretched, I think you might see some increased
Agreed.
inventory in certain areas where
I
they do
agree.
say the house isn't worth what it was, and I don't have the job security to be able to afford it. Maybe they do that, but they're not going to do that unless they're really squeezed with other debts that prevent them from having extra cash and having to make those tough decisions. So, you're going to see that pain, but I think most Americans are going to stay in their house and they're going to let other things go.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Again, we do absolutely have a debt problem. Obviously, the government, businesses, but also households. And if we go through a recession, which I mean, there is one coming. There's always one coming. People are going to make choices. My guess is it's student loans, it's credit cards, it's cars, and in most cases, it won't be the house. That'll be the last thing to go, with obviously some clear exceptions. Anna, where can people find you?
Great. You can find me here on the channel on social media at Anna Kelly, REI Mom, and for real estate coaching and consulting, AnnaKellyInvesting.com.
Thank you so much.